Welcome to the Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs podcast, a place for podcasters to learn what's actually working in the world of podcasting and how to use their podcast to generate consistent leads in their business. I'm your host, Jenny, and I'm so excited you're here.
I don't know about you, but when I first started this podcast, formerly called the Savvy Social Hour podcast for all you OGs out there, I definitely made some mistakes when I launched. So I did want to come on today and kind of share the three main mistakes that I made when launching so you guys can avoid them if you're planning a podcast launch in the near future. Before we dive into the episode, I did want to mention that yesterday I launched my new podcast for podcast managers called the Podcast Manager Power Hour. And don't worry, this podcast isn't going anywhere for the time being, but I'm wanting to switch the focus of my personal brand to helping aspiring and current podcast managers grow their businesses. So if you're listening to this and you're a podcast manager or you're a VA and you're interested in learning more about podcast management, then you need to go check out the Podcast Manager Power Hour. There are 3 episodes already available for you to listen to now, and we'll be releasing new episodes every single Wednesday going forward. So yeah, go check us out. We're available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and more. You can click the link in the show notes to go to the podcast, or you can just type in the Podcast Manager Power Hour in your search bar on any podcast app. But yeah, so let's get into the episode. So when I launched my podcast initially, I'm not going to lie, I had no idea what I was doing. This was back in 2018, so January 2018. I definitely did my research as much as I could beforehand, but at the time, there really weren't as many resources available to me. So I just went with the flow and tried to take as much as I could from those resources. But like I said, there weren't too many because in 2018, podcasts were like starting to become a little bit more popular, but like they weren't where they are now, basically. Nowadays, there's a lot more resources like this podcast and countless other podcasts and blogs and things like that. So there's definitely less mystery behind starting a podcast now in 2022 than there was in 2018. So I have 3 mistakes that I wanted to share with you today. I know I made more mistakes than 3, like 100%, but these are like the main ones that I wanted to share with you. There's others that are like a little more minor. I just want to share kind of the major ones that I want you guys to avoid when you launch your podcast. Okay, so let's get into it. Number 1, that was that I didn't release enough episodes on launch day. So I went back and looked, and I'm pretty sure that I only released 1 episode on launch day, which is just a big no-no. I highly recommend releasing at least 3 episodes on launch day, as we're in a binge society and people like to binge Netflix. They also love binging podcasts. So give them something to binge, and then you can come back the following week with your weekly or bi-weekly episodes. And this is not a mistake I made, but if you are releasing weekly or bi-weekly, make sure that you have a consistent day. So if you start off launching on a Tuesday, your episode should go live every Tuesday after that. Don't try to switch the days up because that just gets confusing for your listeners and eventually they'll fall off. So just pick a day that works for you and launch your episodes every single time on that day. All right, number 2. I didn't have a solid plan on how I was going to integrate my podcast into my existing business. So when I started my podcast, I thought I had considered everything, but I definitely didn't dig deep enough when it came to meshing my podcast with my business at the time. My previous business was called Confetti Social. It was a social media management and VA business. And it didn't really lead into my business at all. It was just like a standalone thing. Like I talked to business owners. We talked about a variety of different topics like Facebook ads, Pinterest, social media, branding, basically whatever you can think of that came to business, we talked about it. But it just really didn't mesh with my business at the time. And when I rebranded to Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs, which is what you're listening to right now, I completely changed everything about it, from the name, the cover art, to the actual content itself. so that it was in 100% alignment with my business. It just made more sense. Now the podcast is about podcasting. My business is a podcast management agency. It just makes total sense. I'm teaching people about podcasting. And then if you guys want to work with me, you have that kind of direct connection. Or if you just want to listen and learn and get access to free resources and paid resources about podcasting without outsourcing, I also have that via this podcast and plenty of other freebies and courses as well. So it gives you that option, but it just makes so much more sense. My other direction was just like standalone. It just didn't operate with my business. It just was like in its own little silo, which in the long run isn't going to be beneficial because you're putting all of this time and effort into something that's not converting back into leads for your business. So it just really didn't make sense in the long term. And then lastly, I lacked a well thought out promotional strategy for the launch and beyond. And this was really not great. So I had obviously planned a bit of promo for my launch, and that was fine. But once the podcast was officially live, I definitely didn't promote as well as I could have on a weekly basis. I would promote some weeks and not others. And not everyone knew that the podcast existed on my social media. So like I needed to be promoting, and promotion of each episode is just really crucial for your growth. So that was a big mistake on my part. And when I relaunched the podcast in its current form and launched my new show, which is called the Podcast Manager Power Hour, I really made sure to have a solid promotion strategy, not just for the launch, but on a weekly basis too. And I'm definitely aspiring to do better with the Podcast Manager Power Hour and integrating it into my socials on my personal Instagram, my personal brand Instagram, which I don't always do that great for this podcast. I'm trying, but it's just not always that amazing. So yeah, I think that's really important, is just to find ways to incorporate it into your social media and stuff, because your subscribers are going to know that it's there, but it's going to be harder to acquire new listeners if you're not talking about it on your social media. And I know I definitely made a few more minor mistakes along the way, but I just wanted to highlight my major mistakes that I think probably hindered my growth the first few months of having my podcast, simply because I just didn't know any better. So I want you guys to be informed and know better here. So that's why I'm sharing these mistakes. And if you're launching your own show soon, I'd love to hear from you. I'm happy to talk through any fears or concerns that you're having around launching, because it does bring a lot of things up when you launch something new. I know I was scared about how my voice sound, how people would judge me if I'm an introvert, but I was like much more introverted when I started my show. So it was just like a really big thing to launch, and it was scary for me. So if you're having those kinds of thoughts, or if you're just trying to get all your ducks in a row to make sure that your launch is as successful as possible, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to shoot me a DM on Instagram. My handle is at jenny.sunneson. So that's JENNY.SUNESON. I'd love to hear from you there. So that is it for today's episode. You can check out the show notes for the episode at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com. And I will see you guys in the next episode.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast player like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Stitcher, and leave a review. You can find us at savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com and on Facebook at Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs and Instagram at Savvy Podcasting. Make sure to join our free Facebook community for podcasters by going to savvypodcastingforentrepreneurs.com/community and join in on the exclusive community just for Savvy Podcasting for Entrepreneurs listeners. I'll see you there.